The rain wasn't cleansing. It was a cold, suffocating weight, each drop a tiny hammer striking Amelia's worn-out soul. It plastered the thin fabric of her dark blue janitor's uniform to her skin, a second, colder skin she couldn't shed. Her shoes, already separating at the seams, squelched with every reluctant step, a miserable soundtrack to the end of her world. In her arms, clutched to her chest like a shield, was a single black trash bag containing everything she owned, 2 changes of clothes, a worn copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God, and a small, cracked photograph of her grandmother. The plastic was slippery, the contents meager, but the weight felt immense. It was the physical manifestation of her failure. Just an hour ago, she had a job. She had a room, a tiny, windowless space in the basement of the building she cleaned, but it was hers. Now, she had only the rain and the indifferent glare of streetlights on wet asphalt. Mr. Harding's voice still echoed in her ears, a slick, condescending drawl that dripped with false concern. "Amelia, we just can't have this kind of liability." He had accused her of stealing office supplies, a box of pens, and a stack of legal pads. It was a lie, a flimsy pretext to get rid of her after she'd quietly asked the other cleaners if their paychecks were also short again this month. She hadn't shouted, hadn't made a scene. She had simply asked a question, and for that, her world had been dismantled. He had stood there, his belly straining the buttons of his cheap suit, a smug little smile playing on his lips as he watched security escort her out, not even giving her time to properly pack. They had thrown her things in the bag for her. Now, at midnight, the city felt like a vast, hungry mouth, and she was just a morsel being washed toward its throat. A tear, hot and defiant, traced a path through the cold rain on her cheek. Where could she go? What could she possibly do? It was in that moment of absolute despair, as she stood shivering at a crosswalk, that a river of light cut through the downpour. A long, black SUV, silent as a shark, glided to a stop directly in front of her. It was so out of place in this forgotten, industrial part of town, its polished exterior reflecting the distorted, weeping city lights. The windows were tinted, impenetrable voids. For a moment, she thought it was a threat, another predator in a city full of them. She clutched her bag tighter and took a step back, but the rear passenger door opened with a soft, expensive hiss, spilling a warm, golden light onto the wet pavement at her feet. From the opulent darkness of the vehicle's interior, Jin-Woo Kwon watched the woman. He saw not just a figure in the rain, but a story. He saw the rigid set of her shoulders, a desperate attempt to maintain dignity against a world determined to strip it away. He saw the way she clutched that cheap plastic bag, as if it contained crown jewels, and not the meager scraps of a life. His driver, a stoic man named Min-jun, had been about to speed through the intersection, but Jin-Woo had held up a hand, a single, almost imperceptible gesture that brought the 2-ton vehicle to a silent halt. He had built an empire on his ability to see the cracks in things, in business deals, in alliances, in people. And in this woman, drenched and alone, he saw a fracture so profound it resonated with something deep inside him, a cold, dormant memory of his own. The city was full of suffering. He knew that better than anyone. It was the currency his world traded in. He usually drove through it with a detached, clinical disinterest. But not tonight. Not her. The defiance in her posture, the refusal to completely collapse under the weight of the storm and whatever burden she carried, it was familiar. It reminded him of his mother, years ago, facing down a landlord with that same quiet, unbreakable spine. "Stop the car," he had said, his voice low and calm, yet it carried an authority that needed no volume. The door opened. He watched as she flinched, her fear a tangible thing in the rain-soaked air. He could see the calculations in her eyes. Run, fight, freeze. He leaned forward slightly, his face remaining in the shadow of the cabin, only his tailored suit and the glint of his watch visible in the interior light. He wanted to project calm, not menace, a difficult task given who he was and how he looked. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not the shout of a predator, but a quiet, resonant inquiry that cut through the sound of the rain. "What happened to you?" It was not a question of pity. It was a demand for facts, a surgeon's inquiry into a wound. The simplicity of it seemed to stun her more than a threat would have. Her fear was still there, but a flicker of confusion, of exhaustion, crossed her face. She just stood there, water dripping from her hair, her knuckles white around the handle of her bag, a solitary island in a storm he had just decided to calm. Amelia stared into the warm light spilling from the car, her mind struggling to process the question. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't lewd. It was direct, almost clinical, and in its darkness, it was strangely disarming. A man sat in the shadows of the back seat, a silhouette of immense stillness. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she could feel the weight of his attention, an unwavering focus that was more intimidating than any physical threat. Her first instinct was to run, but her legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot by sheer exhaustion. What was the point? Where would she run to? She had nothing left to lose, a terrifying and, in a strange way, liberating realization. She took a shallow, ragged breath that tasted of rain and exhaust fumes. "I lost my job," she said, her voice hoarse, barely a whisper against the drumming of the rain. The man in the car said nothing, simply waited. The silence was an invitation, a blank space demanding to be filled. And suddenly, the dam of her composure, so carefully maintained for hours, began to crack. The words tumbled out, not as a coherent story, but as fragmented pieces of her humiliation. "My boss. Mr. Harding, he said I was stealing pens. He said I stole pens." She almost laughed, a broken, bitter sound. "He fired me. The job came with a room in the basement. They made me leave right away." She gestured with her head towards the trash bag. "This is everything." She finally looked up, trying to pierce the shadows within the car. "He lied. I didn't take anything. He was shorting our paychecks. All of us. I asked about it." The man leaned forward, and for the first time, she saw his face. He was Korean, with sharp, intelligent eyes that held no pity, only an unnerving intensity. His features were handsome, but etched with a severity that suggested he was a stranger to frivolity. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit that seemed to absorb the light. He wasn't a policeman. He wasn't a social worker. He was something else entirely. "Get in a car," he said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of what was about to happen. Amelia hesitated. Every warning bell in her head was screaming. Getting into a stranger's car in the middle of the night was the stuff of cautionary tales. But then she looked down the empty, rain-slicked street at the indifferent, dark windows of the surrounding buildings. The world had already done its worst to her tonight. What more could this man possibly do? With a sense of fatalistic surrender, she took a step forward, out of the cold rain and into the impossible warmth of the SUV. The leather seats were soft, the air was dry and smelled faintly of sandalwood and power. The door closed behind her with a solid, definitive thud, sealing her off from the storm and the life she had just lost. The journey was silent, the city a blur of weeping neon lights through the tinted windows. Amelia sat rigidly on the edge of the plush leather seat, clutching her bag of belongings on her lap. The man, Jin-woo, hadn't spoken another word since she'd gotten in. He simply sat opposite her, his gaze fixed on the passing cityscape, though she felt his awareness of her as a constant, humming pressure in the quiet cabin. The sheer luxury of her surroundings was dizzying. The silence itself was a commodity she hadn't experienced in years, a stark contrast to the constant hum of industrial cleaners and the thin walls of her basement room. They pulled up not to a police station or a shelter, but to the gleaming, sterile entrance of a high-rise hotel that pierced the night sky like a needle of glass and steel. A doorman in a long coat rushed forward with an umbrella, but Jin-woo's driver was already out, opening her door. She followed Jin-woo through the lobby, a cavern of marble and hushed reverence, feeling acutely aware of her drenched uniform and the trash bag in her arms. People averted their eyes, but no one dared to stop them. Jin-woo's presence was a force field, parting the sea of quiet judgment. An elevator whisked them upwards in unnerving silence, opening into a private penthouse suite. The view was breathtaking, the entire city spread out below like a carpet of shattered jewels. "You will stay here tonight," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty living room. "There is food in the kitchen, clothes in the closet. Someone will bring you what you need." He gestured to a sleek, black phone on a glass table. "My number's programmed in. Do not leave this suite." Amelia stood in the center of the room, dripping onto a priceless-looking rug, overwhelmed. "Why?" she asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. "Why are you doing this?" He turned to face her fully, and his dark eyes were unreadable. "My mother once worked as a cleaner," he said, the admission so quiet she almost missed it. "She was an honest woman in a dishonest world. I do not like men like your Mr. Harding." The explanation was both everything and nothing. It offered a glimpse into his motivation, but revealed little of the man himself. Before she could respond, he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him with the same soft finality as the car door. Alone, Amelia slowly lowered her bag to the floor. She walked to the panoramic window and pressed her hand against the cool glass. Below, the city that had chewed her up and spit her out just hours before now seemed small, a toy set she could hold in her palm. The whiplash was nauseating, from a wet curb to a penthouse in the sky. It didn't feel real. It felt like a dream she was terrified to wake up from, a fragile bubble of safety she knew could pop at any moment. She had been saved, but she had no idea by whom or what price this salvation would ultimately demand. The next morning, Amelia awoke in a bed larger than her entire previous room, tangled in sheets with a thread count she couldn't begin to imagine. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a stark contrast to the perpetual gloom of the basement she had called home. For a disorienting moment, she thought it had all been a fevered dream brought on by cold and despair. Then she saw her wet uniform, draped neatly over a chair to dry, and the black trash bag standing sentinel by the door. It was real. A quiet knock at the door revealed a woman in a crisp hotel uniform with a rack of clothes and several shopping bags. There were simple, elegant dresses, trousers, soft sweaters, new shoes, toiletries, an entire wardrobe. "Mr. Kwan's compliments," the woman said with a small, professional smile before disappearing. Amelia touched the soft cashmere of a sweater, a texture so foreign and luxurious it felt like a sin. Later, the black phone buzzed. It was him. "There is a meeting at noon," Jean Wu's voice said, devoid of preamble. "A car will be waiting for you downstairs. I would like you to be there." There was no room for refusal in his tone. She dressed in a simple navy blue dress and flat shoes, feeling like an imposter in a life that wasn't hers. The car, another silent black sedan, took her not to a corporate office building, but to a sleek, minimalist restaurant, closed for a private event. Jean Wu was waiting for her in a private room, a stark space with a single large table. He stood as she entered, a gesture of respect that felt both grounding and surreal. A few minutes later, Mr. Harding was escorted in by two large, impassive men. His face, usually florid and smug, was pale, his eyes wide with confusion and burgeoning fear. He saw Amelia, and a flicker of angry recognition crossed his face, quickly replaced by panic as he took in Jean Wu's calm, predatory stillness. "What is this? Who are you?" Harding blustered, trying to project an authority he no longer possessed. Jean Wu didn't answer. He simply gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit down, Mr. Harding." The command was spoken so softly it was almost a whisper, yet Harding obeyed instantly, his body folding into the chair as if his strings had been cut. Jean Wu slid a thin tablet across the polished table. "Sterling Services," he said, naming the cleaning company. "Your company. It seems to have some accounting irregularities." On the screen was a spreadsheet, its columns and rows detailing years of systematic wage theft, of hours doctored and paychecks shaved. Harding's face went from pale to ashen. This is illegal. You can't have this." Jean Wu leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. "What is illegal, Mr. Harding, is stealing from people who have nothing. What is illegal is creating false accusations to silence those who ask for what they are owed. You accused this woman of stealing pens. But this tablet shows you have stolen over $200,000 from your employees in the last 3 years alone. Amelia sat perfectly still, watching the man who had ruined her life shrink under the weight of Jean Woo's quiet, methodical dissection. The power in the room had shifted so completely it had altered the very air, and for the first time in a very long time, she felt the flicker of something she had thought was extinguished forever. Hope. Mr. Harding stammered, his bravado completely shattered, replaced by a desperate, sweating fear. I don't know what you're talking about. Those records are fabricated. This is entrapment. He looked from Jean Woo's implacable face to Amelia's silent one, searching for a crack, a weakness he could exploit. He found none. There was only a cold, unified front of judgment. Fabricated? Jean Woo said, a hint of dry irony touching his lips for the first time. It was not a humorous expression. It was chilling. My accountants are exceptionally thorough. They are artists of numbers, and your books, Mr. Harding, are a clumsy forgery. He tapped the screen, and a new file opened, a series of audio recordings. He played the first one. It was the voice of another cleaner, a tired, older woman with a thick accent, detailing how Harding had threatened her with deportation when she complained about her missing wages. He played another, a man describing being forced to work with unsafe chemicals without proper gear, his subsequent health issues dismissed by the company. Story after story, a chorus of the exploited, their voices filling the silent, elegant room. Harding slumped in his chair, the sound of his own corrupt world collapsing around him. This was not just about Amelia anymore. Jean Woo was not merely seeking retribution for one woman. He was performing a systemic extermination of a rot he had uncovered. His investigation, conducted with terrifying speed and efficiency in the hours since he had met Amelia, had gone far beyond one man's petty theft. His team had unearthed a web of corruption. Sterling Services was a shell, a front for laundering money, for insurance fraud, for violating dozens of labor laws. Harding was just a grubby, mid-level manager, a useful tool for the real owners who remained in the shadows. But Jean Woo was a man who hated shadows. You are a symptom, Mr. Harding, Jean Woo continued, his voice a low, steady scalpel. A manifestation of a sickness. And I am the cure. He slid a second tablet across the table. On it was a live news feed. A local station was breaking a story, broadcasting from outside the Sterling Services headquarters. A swarm of federal agents from the Department of Labor and the IRS were raiding the building, carrying out boxes of documents. The headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Major cleaning corporation raided in multi-agency fraud investigation. The story wasn't just about stolen wages anymore. It was about tax evasion, racketeering. The entire rotten edifice was being torn down, publicly and spectacularly. Amelia watched, her heart pounding. The injustice she had suffered was not an isolated incident, but a pattern, a business model. Seeing it all laid bare, exposed to the light for the entire city to see, was a vindication so profound it left her breathless. It was more than justice for her. It was justice for everyone whose voice had been too small to be heard. The public dismantling of Sterling Services was swift and brutal. The news cycle was dominated for days by the scandal, with each new revelation more damning than the last. The unseen owners, men with respectable names and positions on charity boards, were exposed and indicted. Their assets were frozen, their reputations incinerated in the court of public opinion long before the legal proceedings began. Mr. Harding, a small fish in a large, polluted pond, was one of the first to be arrested, his perp walk a pathetic spectacle of a man utterly broken. Jean Woo ensured Amelia was insulated from all of it. She remained in the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, watching the storm unfold from a safe distance. He visited her one evening, not as a powerful benefactor, but with a quiet, almost hesitant demeanor she hadn't seen before. He brought with him a single, heavy briefcase. He placed it on the table between them and opened it. Inside were stacks of cash neatly bundled. "This is not a gift," he said, meeting her eyes. This is a payment. My accountants calculated every dollar stolen from every employee of that company for the last 5 years, with interest and damages. This is your share. It was a staggering amount of money, more than she had ever dreamed of seeing. She stared at it, then back at him. The others? The people on the recordings? She asked. A trust has been established, he replied, administered by a reputable law firm. Every single victim will be made whole. Their money is already being distributed. This act of meticulous restitution, of ensuring that justice was not just punitive but restorative, moved her more than the money itself. It was a moral clarity that was absolute. I still don't understand why, she said softly. This is more than just helping someone. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if looking back through time. When I was a boy, he began, his voice low and laced with an old pain, my father worked for a man like Harding. He was a good man, a proud man. He was injured on the job due to faulty equipment. The company denied it, fired him, and blacklisted him. We lost everything. Our home, our savings. We had nothing. He paused, his jaw tight. My father died a year later. Not from the injury, but from the shame. From the feeling of being powerless. I swore then that I would never be powerless again. And that I would never stand by while the powerful crushed the weak for profit. In that moment, he was no longer the intimidating, untouchable figure. He was a boy who had lost his father to injustice, a man forged in the fires of that loss. Amelia felt a profound wave of empathy, a connection that transcended their bizarre circumstances. She reached across the table and, without thinking, placed her hand over his. His skin was cool, but he didn't pull away. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers, a silent acknowledgement of a shared understanding, a bond formed in the wreckage of two very different, yet similar, pasts. In the weeks that followed, the city outside the penthouse window began to change, mirroring the transformation within Amelia herself. One morning, she saw a demolition crew arrive at the former headquarters of Sterling Services. The building, a monument to greed and exploitation, was systematically torn down, its facade crumbling into dust. Watching it fall felt like a physical release, the final, definitive end of a dark chapter. The money sat in a newly opened bank account, a number so large it felt abstract. But it wasn't the money that empowered her, it was the freedom it represented. It was the knowledge that she would never again be at the mercy of a man like Harding. She spent her days reading, planning, dreaming. The worn copy of Their Eyes Were Watching God was no longer just a comfort object. It was an inspiration. She wanted to build something, not tear it down. She decided to use a portion of the restitution to open a small, free library and community center in the very neighborhood she had once walked through in the rain, a place for learning and sanctuary. She presented the idea to Jean Wu one evening as they shared a simple meal in the suite. He listened intently, his expression unreadable as always, as she passionately laid out her plans for literacy programs, job-seeking workshops, and a safe space for people to simply exist without expectation. When she finished, flushed and breathless, he was silent for a moment. "It is a worthy ambition," he said finally. Then he took out his own tablet and began sketching out a business plan, pointing out potential zoning issues, recommending contractors, offering advice with the sharp acumen of a man who built empires for a living. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was becoming her mentor, her partner in this new endeavor. Their relationship shifted into a new, comfortable intimacy. They talked for hours, not about his shadowy business or her painful past, but about books, architecture, and the future. She discovered a dry wit beneath his severe exterior, and he seemed to be drawn to her resilience and the fierce compassion that drove her. One night, they stood by the window, looking down at the city lights. "You're not afraid of me?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "I know what people say I am." Amelia turned to face him. She saw the man who had shown her kindness, who had pursued justice with righteous fury, who had revealed the wounded boy he once was. "I'm not afraid," she said softly. "I see who you are." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. The gesture was tentative, questioning. She leaned into his touch, a silent consent. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or possession, but one of profound tenderness and respect, a quiet promise in the heart of the glittering city. The shell of the old building was gone, replaced by the clean, hopeful frame of a new one. Amelia stood on the pavement across the street, a hard hat on her head and a roll of blueprints in her hand, a sense of profound, bone-deep satisfaction washing over her. The library was taking shape, its walls rising from the very ground that had once supported a monument to corruption. It was her vision, her work, her future. She was no longer the woman in the rain, defined by her loss. She was a creator, a builder. Jin Woo was a constant, quiet presence in this new chapter of her life. He never interfered, never used his immense resources to take over her project. Instead, he supported her, offering guidance when asked, celebrating every small milestone with a rare, genuine smile that was reserved only for her. He would visit the construction site, dressed not in his usual severe suits, but in casual clothes, looking for all the world like any other interested investor, though his sharp eyes missed nothing. Their romance deepened, away from the sterile luxury of the penthouse and grounded in the shared reality of their project. It was a relationship built on quiet moments, sharing coffee from a thermos amid the sawdust and noise of construction, debating the perfect shade of blue for the children's section, his hand finding hers as they walked through the unfinished rooms, imagining the future that would unfold within them. One evening, after a long day of meetings with contractors, they sat on a bench in a nearby park as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. "I never thought my life would look like this," Amelia confessed, leaning her head on his shoulder. I thought it was over that night. It was a beginning," he said, his arm wrapping around her. For both of us, he had begun to change, too. The cold, controlled armor he wore around the world seemed to melt away when he was with her. She brought a warmth and a purpose to his life that had nothing to do with power or revenge. She was his peace, the quiet harbor in his tumultuous world. "When this is finished," he said, looking towards the skeleton of her library, "what will you do next?" "I'll be here," she answered simply, "making sure the doors stay open. Making sure there's always a light on for anyone who needs it." She turned to him, her expression serious. "And you?" He met her gaze, his dark eyes soft in the twilight. "I'll be here with you," he said. The words were a vow, simple and absolute. He kissed her again, a deep, reassuring kiss that spoke of home, of permanence, and of a future they would build together, brick by brick. The woman he had found broken in the rain had, in turn, saved him from a solitude of his own making. The grand opening of the North Star Community Library was a testament to the power of transformation. The building was beautiful, a modern structure of glass and warm wood, filled with light and the smell of new books. It stood as a beacon of hope in a neighborhood long accustomed to neglect. The entire community turned out. Among the crowd were dozens of familiar faces, the former employees of Sterling Services, their lives now stable, their stolen wages returned. They greeted Amelia with tears and hugs, their gratitude a palpable force in the room. They were not victims anymore. They were survivors, part of a community that was healing together. Amelia stood at a small podium, looking out at the sea of faces. She wore a simple, elegant dress, her confidence radiating a quiet strength that captivated the room. She didn't speak for long, but her words were powerful. "A library is more than a building with books," she began, her voice clear and steady. "It is a promise. It is a promise that no matter who you are or where you come from, you have a right to knowledge. You have a right to a safe space. You have a right to dream." She looked around the room, her gaze lingering on the children already exploring the reading nooks. This place was built on the belief that one person's story matters. That everyone's story matters. "This is not my library. This is our library." A wave of applause filled the room. From the back, standing unobtrusively by a bookshelf, Jin Woo watched her. A genuine, unguarded smile touched his lips. He saw not the woman he had rescued, but a leader, a force of nature in her own right. He felt a surge of pride so immense it almost took his breath away. Later, as the celebration wound down and the library emptied, he found her in the quiet of the main reading room, running her hand along the spine of a book. The setting sun cast long shadows through the large windows, bathing the room in a golden glow. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, simply breathing in the atmosphere of what they had accomplished. "You did it," he murmured into her hair. "No," she said, turning in his arms to face him. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "We did it." The rain that had defined the beginning of their story was a distant memory. The storm had passed. Here, in the sanctuary they had built from the ashes of injustice, was a new dawn, clear and bright and filled with endless possibility. They were two solitary souls who had found each other in the dark, and together, they had created their own light.